Thank you, Ziyanda, for agreeing to share your work with us on our Wednesday platform, seminar platform. Just a short bio what Ziyanda sent us. Ziyanda Stuurman is a political science and security studies graduate who is currently a policy manager based at Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab at the University of Cape Town. Ziyanda is a Fulbright and Chevening scholar whose master's degree research on the militarization of policing in Brazil and South Africa was published in the South African Journal of International Affairs in April 2020. Her broader research and writing on policing, justice, law, and society was published in a book titled Can We The Future of Policing in South Africa in June this year. Thanks, Ziyanda, again for again sharing your work with us, and we look forward to this. I will just switch off the video just in case if there is any problem with the connection. And over to you, Ziyanda.
Great. Thank you so much, Anandarup. And, thank you to everybody who's here today. I'm really excited to do this presentation. I'm glad that, the Historical Studies Department has invited me to do this talk and to really sort of talk through the long history of policing and the idea and really almost the sort of complication of policing as not just being, an issue that has sort of arisen over the last couple of years, or even trying to think of it in the last 10 years, and what we kind of know as the Zuma years, but rather to understand that, policing has a colonial core and a long historical core that really informs the way that, that the SAPS as an institution functions as we know it. And so on that note, I'll sort of jump straight in and say that, I open my book, which is Can We Be Safe? The Future of Policing in South Africa, by actually going through a really long, in the first chapter and a bit of the book, going through a really long sort of exploration of the history of policing in South Africa. It's a very long history. It's fairly sort of detailed in a lot of ways. But what it comes down to really is understanding and knowing that policing as we know it is a construct of colonialism, and more specifically, it was designed and implemented as a way to protect the products of colonial plunder. So colonial governments established police forces to protect the officers, the assets, and the infrastructure of extractive industries that were formed in the colonies. They were also established to ensure public order against the threat of rioting, uprising, sabotage, and later what became organized action aimed at gaining independence. So national police forces in both Canada and Australia were established to control the indigenous populations in those countries, as they served as well as security and protection services for settler populations. This is true of many other settler colonies, and including colonial era South Africa. So colonialism relies on occupation and the apportionment of land and granting property rights. Therefore, ownership rights must be enforced or by a duly appointed institution. This is also one of the key and core roots of where police forces and the idea of criminal justice systems has evolved from. Much of the same logic that applied in the establishment of police forces in the colonies also animated the creation of police forces in the colonial homelands in Europe. So for example, and the US as well. So for example, the British police was broadly formed around the need to quell Irish nationalism in occupied territory and to protect the interests of the wealthy in England, particularly in London. As you may or may not know, the reason why to this day police officers in the United Kingdom are called bobbies is because they were named after Sir Robert Peel, who was the administrator of the Royal Irish Constabulary and in 1829 became the head of the London Metropolitan Police Force. This was the first major modern police force in the world, and one that was replicated across many other cities and countries since then. In the world of criminology and security studies, Robert Peel is commonly known as the father of modern policing. All of this is to say that the formation of a British police force was heavily influenced by the experience and the administration of a military occupation in what is today known as both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So by the late 1800s, professionalized police forces were present across various colonies around the world. These standing forces evolved out of colonial armies and military formations that typically accompanied colonial administrations authorities, and settler populations as they arrived and were established. The original purpose of police forces was thus the protection of the colonial capitalist world order. They were built to be capable of both managing the potential threats, and these ran the gamut of insurrectionist threats, organized labor, and other related threats that were posed by growing urban populations in cities like London, New York, and others, and protecting the output from extractive and exploitative economies that colonial administrations had built both at home and abroad. The earliest iteration of a police force in South Africa was established in 1652 in Cape Town. Sorry about that. The earliest iteration of a police force in South Africa was established in 1652 in Cape Town, where a group known as Fiscal's Law Enforcement Officers operated from that year until about 1840, before it became known as the Cape Peninsula Urban Police Force, from about 1840 onwards. These officers were charged with maintaining law and order in the Cape Colony and worked in partnership with the Night Watch from 1886 until about the early 1900s. The Night Watch was responsible for overnight surveillance operations in the emerging metropole, commonly known today as Cape Town. And these police agencies merged in the late 1800s into the police force, and which was then later formalized into the SAP, which was formed in 1913. As these systems go, or tend to go, the creation of a police force necessitated the creation of a criminal justice system. So in the Cape Colony between 1686 and 1848, that became the magistrates' law enforcement officers, who both policed rural areas in the Cape Colony and appointed magistrates and officers to enforce laws and detain convicted criminals. So between 1848 and 1913, these units were replaced by the rural police, which patrolled apportioned districts, appointed chief constables and resident magistrates, and established small forces across the area. Mirroring the rise of paramilitary organizations in Ireland and other British colonies, the Cape Colonial Forces were established in 1855 after the British took over the Cape from the Dutch and granted the colony representative government. This CCF was an amalgamation of already existing militias and semi-structured military units, namely the Frontier Armed and Mounted Police, the Burger Force, and the Volunteer Force. The organization this organization was replaced by the Union Defense Forces once South Africa officially acquired Union status in 1910. So elsewhere in the country, police forces were established in the other 3 colonies prior to the formation of the Union, namely the Natal Colony, the Orange River Colony, and the Transvaal Colony. Proclamation 18, signed on the 1st of April 1913, created the South African Police. The first commissioner of police in South Africa was therefore Colonel Theo Trutter, and he commanded a force of about 5,882 men. In this way, colonialism created this country's police force, and one can today draw a straight line from Fiscal's law officers in 1652 to the present day policing structure as we know it, particularly in terms of a top-down and hierarchical nature. This isn't unique to South Africa alone, and many other British colonies, especially on the African continent, have their roots and origins firmly planted in their own histories of colonization, plunder, and extraction. Even in the United States, the localized and the disparate system of policing in that country rose out of slave patrols that caught enslaved people who tried to run away from their masters or to rise up against them. It is impossible to discuss policing anywhere in the world, in any post-colonial society, and absolutely in South Africa, without examining the colonial history that I've just gone through and tried to give a very brief overview of course, stretching almost 300 years. So the colonial and apartheid roots of the police in South Africa have everything to do with how the institution functions today. I often point out in similar discussions like these, that the 100-year history of policing in South Africa is bookended by the adoption of Proclamation 18, which established the SAP, and also the fact that, and this was while the country was under British colonial rule, and also the fact that in that same year, in 1913, the Transvaal miners' general strike was the first instant in which a new and rough around the edges South African police engaged in the violent repression of labor unrest amongst strikes that threatened both the economic and political elite in the country. This was particularly clear when police and military troops charged on a large assembled group of striking mine workers in Market Square in Johannesburg on the 4th of July, 1913. And on the next day, on the 5th of July, police and military troops opened fire on another larger group of striking mine workers who had assembled in a protest outside the Rand Club. This incident killed 25 people, and in the violence that day, hundreds more were injured. 99 years later, over several days in August 2012, 2 security guards, 2 police officers, and a total of 36 mine workers were killed at the Lonmin mine in Marikana near Rustenburg. So much of what we know as policing in this country, so much of what we understand it to be, and importantly, so much of what we think of public order policing sadly hasn't changed as much as this country has between 1913 and 2012. In the face of this kind of history of the SAPS, as well as 5 decades of apartheid policing, much of which we all know in varying degrees, the recent history of policing in the country reflects just how difficult it is to fix policing, if that's the goal, or if the goal is to altogether dismantle policing as it is a practice and institution, and try to then chart a radically different way forward. I would argue that if we want to change what policing is and what it looks like, we also have to have a deep exploration of what non-state policing or alternative forms of community safety, community justice, and community accountability look like. There have already been piecemeal efforts, for example, to try and fold in decades-old customary law and rural conventions of community safety and community justice forums into the SAPS. And this is specifically tried to be done in places like, or in parts of the Eastern Cape in about 2017. But none of these efforts have actually moved past an initial sort of pilot stage. These efforts have also largely been focused or led by the SAPS, when in fact we need communities, we need civil society, we need historians, we need sociologists and others who are working in collaboration with the SAPS, but also the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. This is a major problem if we're trying to learn lessons from history. If we want to recognize that policing has a very deep colonial history, and that history must be both confronted and then excavated from the modern police service that we say we want to build and one that we want to serve communities. If and when we have competent administrators, competent policymakers, political personnel and leadership, as well as operational leadership, maybe we can have this deep and difficult conversation, and not one that's just focused on the last 2 months of issues arising from the police service and their inability to respond to the July unrest. But rather, we need a far more and a far wider conversation about what it is and what it will take to truly and deeply transform the SAPS to meet the needs of South African communities. We could enter into a whole nother conversation with criminologists who are here at UCT, practitioners who are at the Institute for Security Studies, as well as academics at the University of Pretoria, the University of the Western Cape, at UNISA, and at other institutions on their work on the real mechanics of reform, the transformation of the police service, and yes, even the possibility of police and prison abolition. For those of you who are interested in more of this work and the space in academia, I would say it's an incredibly exciting space to be in right now, and to think through and try to think with people. We have real momentum around trying to find, I guess you would term them solutions to our policing crisis, but ones specifically that don't just involve giving the police more money, giving them more guns, and giving them an almost unlimited mandate to do policing, when what that means is that they do the work of punishing people who commit crime and not actually doing the work of trying to prevent crime as a social issue that needs many myriad interventions. In my book, and particularly in the last 2 to 3 chapters, I really try and think through and sort of go through ideas of what this fixing or even what really a dismantling of the police service, but also a criminal justice system in the way that we know it involves and what that means. And in summary and in short, a lot of what that means is really decriminalizing what we already know to be offenses that particularly target and harm poor and marginalized people. And this, again, runs the gamut from decriminalizing minor drug use to decriminalizing and possibly legalizing sex work, all the way to decriminalizing protest and the way that that's policed and the way that that's quote unquote punished. But there are many, many others who are thinking in far wider and far and more sort of far-reaching terms, and these include, these academics or practitioners include Dr. Kelly Gillespie, who's at the University of the Western Cape. It includes Sohela Surajpal, who's a legal scholar who's particularly written about the issue of prison abolition, and many others who are really trying to think through what seems like a complex and almost even imported idea of abolition, because I think a lot of people in South Africa also don't understand that we have our own history of abolitionist movements and abolitionist thinking that are really quite rooted in even the Freedom Charter from 1955. So this idea that we can transform policing and do so in a deep, meaningful, and truly sort of complicated and complex way is not new. And certainly would have been there in 1994, when the country moved into democratic reform. But a lot of that momentum has been lost. The idea again that we need a sort of labyrinth and large police, court, and prison system hasn't really been complicated and problematized by the fact that we live in the most unequal society in the world. And I think a lot of that has to do with, this lack of recognition of the fact that policing is incredibly complicated and has a much, much longer history rather than just, the 50 years of apartheid, but centuries even before that. And so at this point, I'll close off this talk. And I really invite questions and sort of comments on both the sort of long history that I've presented on, but the idea again of trying to complicate the history of policing far past just the last sort of 50 years, and particularly past just July. Thank you.
Thank you, Ziyanda. That was very concise, and we have a lot of time for discussion. So I'll open the floor to questions and comments. You can just, as usual, you can put up your hands using the hand tool, or you can just switch on your video and ask the question, or you can just ask the question without switching on the video, whatever works for you. So the floor is open now. Mandisa, yes, please.
So I can't use my video today.
That's fine.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I was really delighted that you raised the issue of decriminalization of sex work because, police are often perpetrators. So I'm saying that arresting sex workers, they're then doubly victimized because they are raped by police officers. And then there's a further matter, which is that when they are raped, they then can't go to the independent police investigative directorate, which in and of itself, I would argue is part of the problem in terms of ensuring police accountability as regards human rights violations. But there's a further matter that I wanted to raise, which is, does your work address gender-based violence against women? Because it would seem to me that there's deeply entrenched sexism, homophobia, and transphobia in the police, and it is seldom justice for, what I would term kind of gender-based torture in some instances, So I'm really, really worried about the fact that there isn't adequate justice for victims of gender-based violence against women and homophobic and transphobic hate crimes. So I was just wondering if that's something that you could comment on, but thank you so much. Very interesting presentation.
Thanks, Mandisa, and thank you for that question. So there's sort of two ways to answer it. The first is, I would very openly kind of say that what I've been working on and what I've been trying to work through isn't necessarily, an approach or doesn't, I think, do justice to the issue of gender-based violence in the country. I think that there are, fantastic writers like Nachima Brody and like Pumla Qola, who are doing really excellent work on really, I think, trying to, again, complicate this idea that gender-based violence is, can be fixed with just policing or just sort of not deeply structural issues or solutions. And so in that sense, I would say I 100% agree with you, on the fact that police officers themselves and wider the institution of policing, definitely perpetrate a lot of injustice and particularly gender-based violence. This is, something that I write about and kind of talk about in the sense that the police service itself is a mirror of society, and particularly a mirror of many of the social ills or the social problems that we have in South Africa. And that absolutely means that, there's gender-based violence perpetrated by police officers, but even harassment, between police officers and within individual police stations. So in that sense, I kind of can't give a great or a nicely kind of wrapped up answer, but you're 100% right that if we're ever going to get to a point where we address gender-based violence, we'd also have to do so within the institution of policing, and then widely, look at the issue of transphobia, homophobia, and other forms of, and xenophobia, and other forms of discrimination, both in society and the way that they're then mirrored in policing and wider across the criminal justice system.
We have quite a few questions. I don't know how you want to do this. Maybe we can take one round. So Athambile first, then Shamil, Kamalita, Sandile, and Carolyn. So, and we can take a couple of questions or 2-3 questions at first go, and then maybe come back for another round. Atha, please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Ziyanda, for the interesting, informative presentation. And I'm looking forward to reading the actual book. I wondered if you could say more about the early resistance to policing, because by and large, the narrative is, well, the narrative that I've come across is the kind of the complicity of Black people towards the police force. So I'm thinking of work by Shirley Mpamagona's more recent work of the Zulu policeman in sort of the 1800s and the 1900s. And then you point to the Freedom Charter being like a time and document and moment we can look to sort of to this resistance. But did you find any other kind of historical moments of resistance to, or well, resistance, abolitionist movements to the police, as even it was kind of becoming entrenched in our context? Thanks.
Thanks for that. Ziyanda, do you mind taking another couple of questions? Then maybe we can start with the second round with Sandile. Shamil, please go ahead, Shamil.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. Sorry, my camera is not working properly today, but can you hear me? Yeah, thanks. I was just also a historical question, because you speak about the Dutch period, which is very different to after the rise of the police coming with the British, especially from mid-century and Peel's reforms, etc. And so you're looking at the Dutch pre-industrial, largely pre-industrial. I mean, you have small center in Cape Town, which is urban. And so I just felt that there was too little distinctiveness, that you didn't point out enough the sort of large-scale economic transformations from a pre-industrial economy in the Cape, especially through, say, the changes that comes with the Industrial Revolution, the mining revolution, and then the different character to policing, say on the mines, to a place like Cape Town. So and then recruitment of non-whites, you know, and a far more organic type of feel, if I may say so, to this, so that there is work to be done on sort of people who go into the forces, and largely do early version of community policing almost, so that you see what I feel you're doing is, at the end of your talk, you're becoming a total reformist. You're into policy, you're trying to sell the police, you're making the police a solution, whereas you start off being a total anti-colonial radical, but you disappoint us by becoming a total you know, reformist about policy, and these things all change. But I don't know, because it's not only about colonialism, it's about the state, and it's about all sorts of other things. So I'm wondering if you see that kind of contradiction and these transformations. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Shamil. Thanks for that question. Carmelita, do you want to go after? Carmelita, can you hear us?
Oh, yeah. I think I lost you for a few minutes. Yes, should I ask my question now, or is...
Please go ahead.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay, hi, Ziyanda. Thank you. So I just also, I think, wanted to pick up on one of the things you said, which I think Atambile already raised. But I know, for instance, you are quite critical on the idea that we can't just import this abolitionist discourse, literature, conversation, maybe perhaps from the US here. And you were saying there are kind of these earlier periods or conversations that are happening in South Africa around this as well, which I maybe am not that familiar with. So I just wanted maybe to ask you if you can just speak a bit about that, because I know you also mentioned the Freedom Charter and things like that, but maybe just to take us through some of these conversations that were happening here in earlier historical periods. Thank you.
Thanks, Cami. So, Ziyanda, maybe you can, there are quite a few issues here, so maybe you can respond to them, and then we'll take another round.
Okay, thank you for those questions. So I'll start with what Atambile had asked, you know, more along the lines of other sort of historical records of resistance and abolition. And I think that you know, the work of well, there are many writers for sure, but a lot of the work that Johnny Steinberg did and wrote about, particularly in the early sort of 2000s, as he was looking at the concept of, you know, the fact that, you know, societies and communities actually have to give their permission in many ways, you know, to be policed. And so that's something that both permission and legitimacy of the police service is something that the SAPS has always struggled with. And that has everything to do with you know, with the apartheid history of the country. And so in that sense, there's, you know, that the unwillingness of many communities, you know, to be policed or to recognize the legitimacy and authority of the SAPS, and largely because they were absent from many communities, you know, during apartheid, except to both quell and repress anti-apartheid sort of agitation or movements. And what that kind of means in practice, and this certainly happened in many communities and was heightened through the 1970s and the 1980s, really became this idea that, you know, if the police are only ever in a community there to arrest anti-apartheid activists or to, you know, quell uprisings or protests, then they were rejected as a legitimate, you know, sort of part of the state and part of government, really. And that then meant that, and it's still, I think, true in very, very many ways in different communities, that then meant that, you know, the individual police officers as well were rejected from the communities in which they lived in. And there was this idea again that, the police force, particularly in apartheid, served and were, was there at the benefit of or the behest of a government that wasn't recognized, that wasn't legitimate, and of course wasn't just. And what that's meant is that there's still, street committees or other alternative forms of community safety and community justice that exist outside of the state and exist outside of the SAPS, that people again, sort of point to or refer to in issues of dispute resolution. So in that sense, there's, to kind of, I guess, wrap up, the point that I'm trying to make is that the SAPS struggles with legitimacy in many, many, many communities, and particularly communities across both rural areas and in townships, because of the fact that they were both seen as absent, but also when they were there, they were only ever there to do the work of suppressing anti-apartheid movements and not actually community safety. And again, unless you're really sort of dealing with those issues, and in any way, if we want to transform a police service, then that has to be at the heart of much of the work that the SAPS does, that wasn't necessarily done in the early to mid 1990s. And I think that then brings me, to the question that Shamil asked, around the idea of, kind of reformist and abolitionist movements, and particularly, what I both spoke about in this lecture, but also in the book. And I mean, I think it's always going to be a challenge to try and sort of span these many, many centuries, of policing in South Africa. And I certainly, don't try and don't want to conflate the difference between, what policing looked like, under Dutch colonial rule and what it looked like under British colonial rule, and definitely not in this very, very complicated country we live in. And I think, Shamil, what you picked up on, and this is going to be a bit of a spoiler alert towards the end of the book, but I think what you pick up on is me trying to reconcile with the fact that, yes, I would absolutely love to abolish the idea of a police service, especially the way that it still exists in South Africa. But that's, I don't think, a conversation first that is sellable or marketable in the policy sense, across the country, but also given the fact that we have high crime rates. Again, I'm not saying that the police solve crime. In many, many ways, I critique the idea that they can, and that they exist for anything other than punishing crime rather than preventing crime. But there's a really, really fine line to walk between, the idea of police abolition and the reality of having really high crime rates. And that then, leads into another conversation about like incredibly innovative and what some people would deem radical solutions to that, and particularly around funding social services in this country and working towards crime prevention as opposed to just sort of punishing crime or dragging people through a dysfunctional criminal justice system. But those two things have to happen at the same time. There's no way that we can, I think, work towards an abolitionist future without dealing with the fact that we have this enormous criminal justice system at this point that's funded to the tune of about 179 billion rand a year, but that doesn't produce very many feelings of safety or safe communities. But at the same time, we also have high levels of violent crime across many communities as well. So even that answer, I'm sure, Shamil, you might think is disappointing, or it doesn't sort of cut across the issue very, very easily. But we're in an incredibly difficult and complicated, I think, period in South African history, and particularly around policing. But that also really compels us to ask, what in the world do we want from a police service, if we want one at all, and what that has to look like, and what we're willing to fund. When we talk about funding policing, but also understanding that we're doing so at the expense of other social services or other solutions. And then Carmelita had asked, more about abolitionist movements or conversations in other historical periods. I mean, I think that's a really, really interesting question. And sort of the answer, I guess, that I would immediately kind of think of or point to is the point that I was, trying to make earlier about this idea that in many, particularly rural communities, there's almost I don't want to say a renaissance, because I think that probably oversells what's happening, but there is a real kind of relook and real reimagination of what community safety and what community justice is, particularly because a lot of our urban centers and a lot of our rural areas are super duper different from each other. There are very many issues that aren't the same. And so rural communities have had their own sense and mechanisms for community safety and community justice that don't really match with this idea of policing that we have in the country. And that then kind of speaks to a really interesting conversation that's happening amongst people who work in the security space and criminologists as well, around possibly trying to devolve and decentralize more of policing in the country. At this point, at a political and policy level, policing is a national competency, and there are provincial commissioners, who are in different provinces, and also at the sort of cluster level within provinces. But there isn't very much difference in the how and the why of policing. And that sort of history of rural community safety and justice, I think, is an answer to very many of the sort of issues of we're trying to collect crime stats in South Africa, and so there's only one way to do so, and every police force across every province and in every station has to do so in the same way and report in the same way, even though the work that they're doing in communities is just wildly different from Cape Town to somewhere like Offenbaba, for example. So there's a I think conversation that speaks to sort of non-state policing, but even the idea that we need to have one centralized national police force that comes down from Pretoria with directives and with instructions on how to do policing. And that's a conversation that's deeply rooted in a rural history of community safety and community justice.
Thanks for that, Ziyanda. Sandile, you had a question, and I know Carolyn also probably has one. And Shamil, is this an old hand, or do you want to follow up question? Maybe you can come in after Sandile.
No, I'm an old hand.
Okay. Okay, please go ahead, Sandile.
Thank you very much, Ziyanda, for a brilliant presentation. I look forward to reading your book. I would just like to make a few comments, and of course, one hasn't read your book, so some of them might be unjustified. But have you considered, for instance, the idea that in the democratic South Africa, the baggage of the past, the political baggage of the past, possibly continues to manifest itself in different mutations today? You would know very well, and many of you would know this, that in the past, the SAPS was integral in the maintenance of the illegitimate apartheid regime. But also how this expressed itself is that in the upper echelons of power, you had instances, for instance, where the police commissioner sat in the cabinet and was a very, very critical member of driving the politics of the country. If you think about the total onslaught strategy, for instance, in the 70s, and many other brutal interventions that were to be experienced and lives lost in the process. So I see that generally when we talk about in the 80s, well, in the 90s, late 80s, 90s, and possibly until the dawn of democracy, there was a certain focus on exposing the brutalities of the apartheid state, and there were many books that emerged. I think of Death Squad by Patrick Lawrence, and books now on Eugene Peacock and so on. So that was happening at another level, and there was some investment there. But generally, the public domain, we talk about the corruption, we talk about the police being inefficient, possibly also because of resources, and lastly, we often talk about the police being complicit in the criminal activities that beset our country. But I would like to argue that possibly what is also happening in the police at the moment, the police force, is that the alliances of the past, political alliances, are re-emerging in different guises, because sometimes we make a mistake. I mean, I'm saying generally now as a public, that there is white and black in the police force in a very literal sense. So that white people, for instance, they represent the oppressive voice, and black people, the voices of liberation. But as we know over time, and some of the cases that are in the public domain show us, that kind of binary is no longer useful. And I'm interested to hear if by any chance you also looked into this. In other words, the political ideologies that are at the heart of the challenges that we have as a society, but rooted deeply in what politically is possibly the many forms and expressions of the SAPS. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. Carolyn, please.
Thanks very much, Ziyanda. That was a really stimulating presentation, and you've given me so much to think about. Look, I appreciated enormously this effort at trying to take a long historical view. And so I've got a two-part question, and the first part of the question is very much in the long view. And it's something that you alluded to in the spoken. It may be there in the book more, but I'd like to draw you out on. And that is what the effect of the creation of customary law and the idea that certain things were in the domain of a chief, or in that sort of respect, what the legacy effects of that might be. Because I understand that you are interested in this long view, both to understand the legacy effects, but also maybe even the possibility for a reach for ideas that could be part of the future. And so I'm curious there to what extent in that domain that either robbed some of the possibilities of community policing, of a community sense of responsibility, or in fact maybe even possibly allowed certain residual senses to stay in place. And that goes to the heart of the question that you're interested in, is trying to grapple a bit about how things are different in rural areas and why that's the case. And the legacy effects might be different in rural areas because of the effect of customary law, and how that puts certain kinds of policing activities in the domain of so-called traditional authorities. So that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question, I suppose, goes to the matter of the legitimacy or otherwise of the police. And I wondered what you make of metro police, who are in a rather different space, because they're sort of in the public policing space, and they're dealing with, things like issues that are closer to community, sort of the management of community life. And yeah, so I'd be interested in your comments on that. So two aspects of going to the sort of community side, because I can see that's where you're pushing, trying to see whether there's spaces there that can be opened up for future understandings of policing. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so thank you, Sandile and Carolyn, for those questions. Those are really great, and immediately have given me a lot to think about as well. So I mean, I guess to sort of start with Sandile's question, and particularly around the political ideologies that have driven everything from policing as it was done during the colonial era, but also apartheid policing and what that's meant in the last sort of 27-ish plus years. So to answer this, I guess I would say that in the book, again, what I tried to do in chapter 3 of the book, where I kind of talk about, policing by another name and the sort of change from the SAP to the SAPS. I really also try and delve into a lot of the impossibilities of reform, and this idea that we could take an institution with this sort of incredibly long history in 1994, and we could change a lot about it. Of course, the color of police uniforms, for example, police vehicles, insignia, trying to dismantle the sort of more militarized aspects and hierarchies and traditions of policing, and try to move that into a human rights-based approach, a community-oriented approach, and one that was responsive to communities. And I guess sort of the conclusion that I come to is that was both incredibly difficult, and Sandile is 100% right in terms of the history of police commissioners, and being so closely tied to both the apartheid regime and in the very early years of democratic reform, George Verwoerd being so closely tied to President Nelson Mandela, to the point where I quote in the book, I think it was in 1996, as Mandela was addressing, I think it was at that point, cabinet, and really sort of tried to assuage in many ways many members of the SAPS at that point, and trying to essentially say that there'll be no quote unquote witch hunt, to punish police officers who were involved in apartheid abuses. And that was, I think, the tip of the iceberg in many, many ways, that kind of led to this idea that, that we needed to keep the police structure as it was, and therefore try and sort of build on it, and recruit sort of new police officers and train police officers, without, again, realizing that there had to be an enormous amount of work to excavate the racist and violent and brutal nature of policing, and particularly the practice of policing communities of color and what that meant. And so, yeah, again, this idea that that reform was possible, with trying to sort of tinker here and there, but at the same time trying to assuage, police officers, that there would be no, termed as a witch hunt, but really would have been accountability for apartheid producers. I think really reproduced, this idea that policing could stay the way that it was, with some sort of reform or fixes, and move forward in a modern democratic South Africa. And I think that was definitely the wrong move to make. And I think it's also incredibly important to understand that, when we talk about the history of apartheid policing in particular, there's the way in which, of course, policing was done, and particular incidents that are pointed to, like the Sharpeville massacre, but there's not enough of an understanding of the trend of how the police force was galvanized, how it was funded, how it was increased and boosted and bolstered. Again, as Sandile mentioned, through the total strategy, for example, in the late 70s, and that was particularly around what then sort of was a series of state of emergencies that were declared in the country, and what that meant. So in these kind of states of emergencies, and more money being poured, into policing, and bolstering a militarized police service that was there to prop up and keep the apartheid regime in place. That's really kind of meant that we still even see mirrors of that in more sort of modern policing, given the fact that in 2012, the police budget stood at 56 billion Rand a year. And since then, it's grown to 99 billion Rand a year. And of course, 2012 being Marikana, but also a large, huge increase in the number of public protests and what we know as service delivery protests and others that really mirror, again, a South African government that hasn't been able to meet the needs of communities and hasn't been able to roll out basic services. So you kind of have this, again, this overlap of an increase in policing and police budgets and police resources as a response to social unrest and political unrest. And that's, the two have been very, very similar between the 80s and since about 2012. So I hope that answers that question, or attempts to answer that question, I think, around political ideologies and the sort of political history of the police force and who's in charge of government in many ways. And so to Caroline's questions around the legacy effects of customary law and what that's meant for, I guess, a modern SAPS. I try to raise the point and try and draw parallels, I think, between what many rural communities, what the practice of sort of what the practice of community safety and community justice means in many rural communities is closely linked to, the principles of restorative justice. And the idea, again, is not to necessarily be punitive, but more in a way to try and make both, perpetrators of injustice and victims whole. And that doesn't mean, throwing somebody in prison, or doesn't mean necessarily paying a fine, but understanding that an entire community needs to be healed where there has been harm or where there's been wrong done. And of course, this is only one aspect of it. And it's, not to say that rural life is idyllic and perfect and, that chiefs are, or other rural authorities or rural leaders are these sort of perfect, amazing optimists that try to bring communities together. But that's a part of I think, a lot of or a part of a principle of customary law that could be pulled in and certainly tapped into more, in this idea of what the plurality of policing, but also what the pluralities of justice could look like in the country. And then your question also on Metro Police and the idea that it's, that they're there for the management of community life. So that's a really interesting one, because I think that there's also a large tension between, what the SAPS does and what they're there to do and try and achieve, and what the Metro Police do. So in many circumstances, the Metro Police are there to, what's what I'm looking for, to enforce municipal bylaws. And those are quite different than necessarily national criminal statutes. But also where Metro Police, suspect criminal activity, they're not allowed to make arrests. They, are their purpose is to try and sort of gather as much information and evidence, and to hand that information over, and those who are found to be in violation of bylaws, not bylaws, sorry, but criminal statutes, over to the SAPS. But there's a gap and a chasm between what the SAPS sees itself as doing and what the Metro Police, are working towards. And in many ways, there's, some overlap in a lot of what Metro Police do. And in that sense, I would point to the JMPD, sorry, in Johannesburg, and the SAPS. And there are multiple repeated raids, on small vendors, particularly in the city center in Johannesburg. And that sort of alignment on a deeply, I think, problematic level on this idea that, vendors or traders are in violation of municipal bylaws and therefore have to be criminalized. And in many other circumstances where there are, examples of crime, particularly in our cities, and the enforcement of, drug laws or the issues of sort of drug trafficking and drug trade, and what that means between the SAPS and the Metro Police. And so there's definitely an effort, particularly in Cape Town, for the Metro Police to do more and to have more powers, in sort of crime fighting, quote unquote. But that also has a deep political history, of course, with the DA, being in charge of Metro Police in Cape Town, whereas the SAPS, again, is a national competency and therefore overseen politically, at least, by the ANC. And I guess that's not a sort of, again, neat sort of answer, but there is real complications around what the Metro Police are there to do, and the enforcement of municipal bylaws, and what's sort of seen as larger national and criminal enforcement or law enforcement.
Thanks, Ziyanda. Sorry, Mandisa, you have a question?
Yeah, I suppose it's more of a comment. I was just thinking about transnational crime, racketeering, money laundering, human trafficking, tax evasion, and so on and so forth. It would seem to me, obviously, that is not something that can be managed at a community-based level. I was thinking that then takes us more to the question of public prosecution in South Africa, the role of Interpol, and obviously international law around international treaties on a number of these matters. And what I wanted to say is then we're looking more at global civil society, the media, also I'd argue the judiciary, but I'd be really interested in thinking about decolonizing transnational and international criminality. I mean, it's difficult for us to answer that right now, but I mean, I'm just wondering what it would consist of.
Thanks for that, Mandisa. Are there any other questions and comments? Final round. And I'll just add to what Haley, yes, please go ahead.
Hi there, Ziyanda. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. Thanks so much. I was just thinking about the military police and whether you've investigated. I live near a military base, and I see the military police driving around as well as the Metro Police, and I always wonder, what the functionality is, where they fit in. And then secondly, just interested in the technologies around policing, because I know I know body cameras or body cams are worn by the US police, and I don't know if I've never seen that in South Africa. So I was just interested in different kinds of things like drones and this kind of technology in South Africa. So I don't know if you could speak to that maybe. Thank you.
We are almost at the end of our session. I don't know if you, Ziyan. I mean, I just wanted to add something. I think, thank you for the presentation again. I think I shared with Shamil some of the questions, but I was again wondering, drawing on what Mandisa and Haley just mentioned. So, because I was just reading, Jacob Lamini's Terrorist album, and there's a lot of interesting material that he takes from Breckenridge's work on fingerprinting and state, where he's actually looking at the 1913 moment in terms of his distinctiveness and connection. I mean, in the sense, it is distinctiveness as the period which just precedes apartheid policing, but also distinct from. And so fingerprinting and photography being a part of a larger settler colonial and occupational colonial, because British India plays a big role in that, in terms of fingerprinting technology. So it's not just the settler colonial world that is at play here. So I was just wondering if there is any specificity to what does history do for such policy thinking? I wasn't clear at all, to be honest. That it seemed that for policy documents, history is that little introduction that okay, we know colonialism was bad and policing was a handmaiden of colonialism. Apart from saying that, one isn't very sure how policymakers and policy thinkers the Abdul Latif poverty lab in itself is probably an example of that kind of thinking, and with the Nobel that has again been anyway, not going into that. I'm very intrigued by what history does for policy, because all of this seems to be a very reformist conversation where actual historical detail is very unnecessary. If you say from that there's a straight line from 1652 to contemporary SAPS, there's not much need for actual historical reconstruction. Anyway, I mean, this is something I guess Shamil has raised. I don't know if you want to respond quickly to Mandisa and Haley's points.
Yeah, thank you for that. Mandy, so your question, I think, has stumped a lot of criminologists in very, very many ways. Particularly, I think, when we understand the world being globalized, and sort of understand, both criminal networks and others that sort of thrive again in these in a far more connected world. That's definitely not my, I guess, area of expertise, and I, won't say that I know tons about that. But I agree with you that the idea of decolonizing, particularly international criminal law, or at least trying to, and understanding what that means, is a critically important one, going forward. Just to give an example of that, particularly the drug trade in Cape Town and in Port Elizabeth, or Gqeberha as it's now known. There's a real sort of lack of understanding that in both of those places, both drug trafficking and gang violence have grown exponentially because of post-apartheid South Africa, and the sort of opening to the international economy, and what that's meant for criminal networks operating in both places and in the country, and very much as a sort of gateway into the rest of Southern Africa as well. So I guess I'm not answering the question, I'm sort of compounding it or problematizing it in that sense. Haley, your question as well around technologies around policing, and particularly the kind of use of body cameras and those technologies. That's super interesting, because that's so if we're sort of talking about the idea of abolition being part of a larger American conversation in many ways, and international conversation, the same could be said about sort of reformist policies, and the idea of body cameras also coming up as part of reformist policies, and the churn of reform that says, if we had more money, if we had these body cameras, if we had X and Y and Z, it would make the police less brutal or more efficient. And I guess the answer to that then is, that in many ways, body cameras don't work in the US. They do very little in being able to prevent police brutality. They have, value as evidence in cases and in complaints, against police officers who've used excessive force, or who've had unlawful behavior. But they're often also sabotaged by the officers themselves, or that evidence is hidden, by particularly political actors who have an interest in both having law enforcement on their side, but also protecting law enforcement. And immediately the example of Rahm Emanuel, who was the mayor of Chicago, who helped cover up the murder of Laquan McDonald, is sort of part of that. And so there's been no real movement around body cameras, I think, in South Africa. And I don't know if that's because there's no budget necessarily to have body cameras for the 160,000 plus police officers that we have in the country, or it's kind of more around the fact that they don't necessarily work, and they're not a particularly effective tool. But, and this is particularly interesting, that other technologies around ShotSpotter, for example, that was used in the city of Cape Town to the tune of about 32 million rand. They're just sort of seen as this ballistics kind of sounding or detection technology that could, quote unquote, hear a bullet, triangulate the location, and have police officers sent out there, which just ended up being a huge failure. Really expensive, really terrible sort of system that in many ways both the company and the city tried to inflate the value of. And similarly with sort of cameras in many neighborhoods, particularly I'm thinking of in suburbs in Johannesburg, and that being pushed and driven by a company particularly called Vumacam. And that's in the business, the very lucrative business of private security in many suburbs. And this, again, this idea that technologies could be used in South Africa for security and for policing, but in much of the same way that body cameras don't work in the US, those technologies haven't been particularly effective in South Africa. And again, I think that kind of brings us back to not even conclusion, but the one big, huge main point that crime, especially in our country, is a social issue. And it's not, just a sort of legal or criminal issue. And in that sense, it's very, very complicated and won't be solved by ShotSpotter or body cameras or VumaCam or private security. And I guess then that brings me to Anandaroop's question around, what does history do for policy thinking, which is an incredibly fascinating one, because I think it also asks a lot about policy across the board. So not just in policing in South Africa, but everything in education and health and in so many other fields that sort of show us that there's this really difficult but also deep disconnect between what we can learn from history and what we're putting into practice in policy. So I guess in that sense, it's really kind of to say that there's a recognition of history, particularly in policy circles, but a lot of it also has to do with the fact that the recognition of that history really depends on the actual policy thinkers or the policy makers at the time. There's the politics that sort of go with that. If you were I don't have a great example sort of off the top of my head, but if you were talking to policymakers that are more kind of center-right in their political ideology, and the examples of that being, the DA administrations in the Western Cape government or in the city of Cape Town, and for a while in the city of Johannesburg, their reading of history and what we can learn from history is super duper different to, I think, the readings and analysis and lessons learned from history from other sort of government departments or agencies themselves. So in that sense, it's it becomes the difficult kind of answer of what does history do for policy thinking? And the answer to that is it depends. Depends on who's doing the history, which history they select, what they want to recognize from history, and what they sort of do in terms of policy justification from there. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Ziyanda. I'm just saying that we had a nice conversation, but we've run over our time. I just saw it's almost 10. I actually have another meeting. I'm sure other colleagues have as well. But thank you again. It was nice to have you, and thank you for sharing your work. Thanks, colleagues, for being here, and I'll see you soon.